Hey boys and girls, it's Navinat on No Limit Hold'em. I'm starting a new series. I know I've got a habit of starting these things and getting a couple videos in and kind of aborting mission, but if they take off, then I like to stick with them. I guess we'll just kind of see how that goes, but the idea that I came up with here is to release a series of videos that just focused on one pretty specific thing that you could learn about, and if you're not using it, whatever the concept is that we're going over in that particular video, if you're not already using it, then you can apply it directly and immediately and just start making more money and more profitable plays straight away without having to wade through a long strategy video and pick the things that work for you and forget half of what you may have heard or listened to or learned. So the first one we're going to do in this Getting Better Faster is targeting. The concept of targeting is not always called targeting. There's different people have different ways of describing it, but you will hear people say that they're trying to value target, or they're targeting this part of their opponent's range or that part of their opponent's range, but I haven't actually heard of anybody discussing the concept of, quote, targeting. So I guess it's kind of a thing I'm introducing as an overarching concept, but it's probably something that most people are familiar with in some way, shape, or form. The basic idea is value targeting allows us to sell our hands for maximum value based on the types of hands that we're expecting our opponent to be able to call us or pay us off with. And when we're targeting parts of our opponent's range that may fold to a bluff, then the idea is to allow us to use a bluff sizing that gets the job done against the types of hands that are likely to fold without too much exposure, so without burning too much money against the parts of our opponent's range that will not fold. If you've watched any of my concept videos or all of them or followed anything that I've been doing, you've probably picked up on this idea that I think is really one of the hallmarks of proficiency in anything, and it's the concept of efficiency. And I did a video a little while back on range. Did I call it range efficiency? Elegance. Yeah, range elegance. And I think that elegance and efficiency are almost synonyms in a lot of respects. But I believe efficiency is a hallmark of competence. And I think that if we have efficient ranges, that's kind of another way of saying that we have elegant ranges, and if we've built elegant ranges, then we're probably using good ranges. So what do we mean by efficiency? Well, in just this one concept, I guess in reference to this one idea of bet sizing based on range targets, when I talk about elegance or efficiency, I'm talking about not wasting anything. So that means not putting too many chips in for a bet, so many chips that it causes our opponent to fold. So now we've wasted an entire opportunity to get value. But also when we're bluffing, not wasting any chips that we don't need to waste to get the maximum number of folds. Not necessarily the maximum number of folds, but the I guess efficiency is kind of just the best way to say it overall. When we're using the most efficient sizing to get the job done, then we're kind of buying the most folds for the lowest amount of money, and we're getting just the highest return on investment per bet. Okay, so our most fundamental bets are pretty obviously going to be value bets and bluffs. And the idea is to do a really good job of hand reading and reading the situation, so you're not just kind of firing a quote standard half pot bet or quote standard 2/3 pot bet because that's the thing to do. There's nothing magical about the number 2/3 pot, or there's nothing magical about the size of the pot as a bet. I mean, certainly it's a basis, but there's other things than just the size of the pot that go into correct sizing. For instance, it can often it usually does make sense to use smaller bet sizing with relation to the pot size when stack sizes are small, and to use larger portions of the pot to size your bets when stacks are deeper and you're playing with a higher SPR. But the other thing is, and this is obviously what we're kind of honing in on here, is if we understand the types of hands that are in our opponent's range, and we know that some of those hands are just going to fold almost no matter what kind of bet sizing we use, and some are probably not going to fold almost regardless of the bet sizing that we use, then we've identified something of value in that we can use the smallest number of chips to accomplish the goal of folding out the most hands when we're bluffing, and we can use the largest number of chips to value bet where it's likely to get called. And if we know the types of hands in our opponent's range that are likely to call, then we can probably have a pretty good idea of how to size our bet, how big we can make our bet and still get called. And the same thing with bluffs. If we know that our opponent's range is mostly weak bluff catchers, then that'll give us an idea of how to, or if he's got like mostly weak bluff catchers and busted draws, then we can either try to just target the busted draws in the villain's range and use a very small bluff sizing, or we can go after the bluff catchers and the busted draws using a larger bluff sizing. So we'll probably have to explain that with some some examples. But one thing you may have picked up on here is this is very related. This concept of value targeting or targeting for bluffs it's very closely related to the concept of elasticity. And I think a lot of people have heard of or understand the concept of elastic calling ranges, elastic continuing ranges, or inelastic calling or continuing ranges. And that's more or less what we're talking about, but that's more of a black and white thing where your opponent may be very elastic or very inelastic, and that can tell you that yes, you should size your value bets bigger and your bluffs smaller as a way to exploit your opponent's inelasticity, if that's the case. Or if your opponent is being very elastic with his calling range, then, or I guess conversely is folding range, then you know that you're going to kind of get what you pay for in terms of bluff sizing or value betting. And in fact, your opponent ought to be elastic, and you ought to be elastic with your calling ranges. But situations do come up in game where it simply will not be the case, and there's plenty of situations that I've recognized in hands that I've played where, because of a mistake that I made, and often you're not even able to identify where the mistake was made. Sometimes the mistake is actually made pre-flop. You split your range kind of without realizing you split your range. By the time you get to the river, there's really not much you can do about the fact that your range is going to be kind of inelastic without doing some kind of like outside the box, above the rim, like turning mediocre strength bluff catcher type hands into re-steals and things like that. Sometimes you just accidentally end up in a situation where it makes a little bit of sense to be elastic or inelastic to varying degrees, but in general you should be elastic. If you're playing properly and you're making the right types of, if you're exercising the correct options, then at each point in a hand, at each option, if you're kind of playing defense where you're doing the bluff catching or the calling down, if your opponent is the aggressor, I mean, you really ought to be folding more against large bets and folding less against small bets, which I think sounds intuitive enough, but you'd be surprised if you start paying attention to it. I think how often you end up in a spot where you just can't call a bet of any size. So anyway, elasticity, in case you don't know what it means, we could say that our opponent is elastic, or the situation is elastic, or our opponent's continuing range, should we choose to bet or raise, is elastic when our opponent will fold more hands to a larger bet than he would to a smaller bet, and when there is just a pretty obvious correlation between the size of our bet and the number of folds that we're likely to get. This should always be the case, but actually often is not the case. When it's not the case, and you're able to identify that it's not the case, you can make some really, really profitable bets by not having to risk very much with your bluffs and still having a lot of fold equity, or being able to pile on a ton of money with your value bets and still expect to be called, if not very often, at least really often, relative to using a smaller bet size. So we could say that our opponent is inelastic when he will continue with roughly the same range, regardless of the size bet we choose to use. So the more linear the relationship and the clearer the correlation between the size of our bet and the fold equity we expect to have, the more elastic the situation is, or our opponent or villain's continuing range is. The less correlation there is between the size bet we use and the number of hands we expect to continue against us, the more inelastic or the less elastic the situation is. And being able to identify these situations is it's a thing that if you're not really looking for actively, then you're almost surely missing out. And if you just do nothing else, if you take nothing else away from this video, except that you start paying attention and being aware that these situations can come up, and be actively looking for them, then I think you're automatically going to start profiting. I mean, it's a pretty big deal, to the point where if you're roughly a break-even player and you start doing this, you will become a winning player. And if you're like a slight loser, then you could go to break-even. If you're winning a little bit, you could win a little bit more. So what are the factors that determine elasticity? In general, it's going to stem from a lack of understanding of game theory tenets, but I think the four kind of fundamental factors here would be the playing skill of your opponent, the history and metagame, the table dynamics, so whatever history, reads you have on your opponent, reads you feel like your opponent has on you, etc., the actual run out in a hand, and the overall equity distributions because of the way that ranges are constructed pre-flop to post-flop to whatever street that you're on at the point that you're in, that you're actually looking for the elasticity, or more often you're looking for the lack thereof. So if your opponent's very skilled, he's probably going to be elastic. If your opponent's pretty unskilled, he's pretty likely to be inelastic. If you've got a history of using small, just as an example, you've been caught using small bluffs and large value bets, then that's going to create a dynamic that can have an effect on this, obviously. If the board runs out one way or another, it can lead to situations where your opponent's probably going to be relatively elastic or relatively inelastic. A good example would be if your opponent takes a line that really represents a lot of either nutted value hands or draws, and all the draws brick off, then if your opponent bets, say he check raises the flop on a wet board, he bombs the turn, you call the flop, you call the turn, and the river bricks out, your opponent bets again, his calling range, should you decide to re-raise, is likely to be less elastic than it might otherwise be, because he's just not going to call you with a busted draw, and he's not going to fold the nutted value hand that he's representing. So in a spot like that, if you end up in a situation where maybe you've got a blocker to the nuts and really no showdown value, you're kind of at the bottom of your range. Maybe you were on a draw, or whatever the case may be. It can make a lot of sense for you to use a re-steal size on the river. It's relatively small, and this is exploitative. It's not going to exist in a equilibrium sense. And the other thing is equity distributions, but I think really if you look at all of these other factors, playing skill, history, metagame, table dynamics, and the runout, and then you look at just like pre-flop ranges and put it all together, what you come up with is going to be basically an equity distribution. And if your opponent's got an equity distribution that looks something like the nuts or nothing, then he's probably going to be relatively inelastic. If he's got an equity distribution that looks more like he's got a lot of middle strength hands, that's a spot where your opponent is likely to be very elastic. If your opponent's getting to the river with a ton of top pair weak kicker, second pair with a good kicker type hands, that's a spot where you're probably going to get folds sort of based on how large you bet, which again is the way that it should work. That's the way the game, that's basic bet theory, is the larger your bet sizing, the more folds you get, the stronger your opponent's continuing range becomes. So I guess all of that kind of, the way that it melts together or merges together, that's creating this concept of elasticity or inelasticity. So you might ask the question, and I think I've kind of hinted at this already. Are we being exploitable, or are we exploitable? Are we taking an exploitative approach and therefore open to exploitation when we're targeting? And the answer is yes, but maybe not always in the sense that you're thinking. We can be balanced when we size our bets in relation to our opponent's range, rather than taking a bunch of other considerations. If we're always sizing our bets based on our opponent's range, not our own range, and not the way our range interacts with his range, but if we're really just looking at whether our opponent's going to have a ton of strong hands and then a ton of nothing, or if he's going to have like if we're always targeting our opponent's range, and we're always if we're going to make a bluff in this spot, we're going to bluff the same size as if we're going to make a value bet. And really, when you're value targeting and bluff targeting, that tends to be the case, because you get to a spot where your opponent's just going to have a ton of garbage and not a lot to call you with. You're going to have to use a smaller value bet size, and you're going to be able to use a smaller bluff size. So really the case is, most of the time, when you are value targeting and bluff targeting, when you're really looking at what parts of your opponent's range you expect to fold, what parts of your opponent's range you expect to call, and you're targeting those specific portions of his range and then using your bet size, it usually is the case, it will generally be the case that your value bet sizing and your bluff sizing will be the same. So in that sense, you're not out of balance. So your opponent won't be able to exploit you just on the basis of your bet sizing. But just because this is not a GTO way to size your bets, then fundamentally it cannot be unexploitable. It's just that the ways in which you could be exploited for using this approach are not maybe super intuitive. It can be an exploitative approach, and it can be a very profitable way to play. I think it's the best way to play. But it's going to have us playing somewhat outside the realm of equilibrium or GTO play. The ways to exploit it, really, it's more that using this kind of a strategy is not going to allow you to use perfectly game theory optimal ranges and sizing and lines. So in a sense, you're kind of exploiting yourself more than you're opening your opponent, or you're opening the door for your opponent to make active exploitations. It's like if you're in a situation where you've got a super polarized range, and you get to the river after, say, check raising flop, bombing turn, you get to the river, and you're going to make a bet again. If you're if you're going to have just a very polarized range, where you're either going to have something like the nuts or a busted draw or air, then the game theory solution would have you betting all in with your entire betting range, almost regardless of how big the pots are relative to the stack sizes. So you really, in a GTO sense, if you check raise flop bottom turn, you should often be jamming the river, even if it's like 2 times the size of the pot. And that's going to allow you to use the most bluffs in your range, just based on the indifference principle that your opponent has to call you just often enough with his bluff catchers to keep you not doing better than breaking even on your bluffs, or keeping you indifferent between bluffing or value betting. So when you use value targeting as the way you size your bets, and you use bluff targeting, so you're kind of just range targeting to choose your bet sizing, you won't be able to have this like perfectly unexploitable, perfectly balanced, and maximum EV line every time. But in game, when you're actually playing in any particular situation, I feel like by the time you get to the river, you can do better than just using this kind of like polar versus bluff catcher bet sizing and just shipping 2 times the size of the pot kind of blindly, or sort of just because that's, quote, what you're supposed to do, or what you would do at equilibrium. I think you can actually do better than that. But yeah, it's not going to be equilibrium, and therefore it is exploitable. I wouldn't lose too much sleep over that, though. If you're pretty sure you know where your opponent's at, you can probably do better than equilibrium. And I mean, that's really always the case, right? If you're sufficiently better than your opponent is at poker, and you've kind of got his ranges nailed down better than he's got yours, you'd probably be doing yourself a disservice in general, trying to stick to or close to an equilibrium type strategy. That's my opinion, and it's certainly debatable, but I'm sure you've heard that debate anyway. So a couple examples, and I'm going to be talking about this more often, and I do talk about it when I post my heads-up games that I play, or coaching sessions, or what have you, sweat sessions. But here's just a couple examples. So the first example, we're in a heads-up sit and go. Let's just say it's a $20 heads-up sit and go versus a pretty decent reg. Not anybody like world class, but not a fish. Just, your run-of-the-mill, reasonably decent, probably about break-even, maybe slightly earning player. You are the pre-flop caller out of position. So your opponent opens on the button, and you call out of position from the big blind. I didn't put it in here, but let's just say you're 75 big blinds deep, and your opponent opens for a min raise, and you flat call. If the flop is ace of diamonds, 3 of diamonds, 2 of spades, you check, your opponent bets, you raise, he calls. So you check raise this flop here. The turn comes out the 9 of clubs. You bet again, and are called again. When the river comes an ace, and it's an offsuit ace, it's the ace of clubs, kind of regardless of what your actual hand is this a spot where we would expect our opponent to be elastic, or is this a spot where we'd expect our opponent to be inelastic? Now let's look at this other example before we answer that question and see if you can see the difference and if it becomes apparent to you. So in the second example, we're in a 6 max online cash game. Let's call it NL50. And player open raises and you 3-bet from the button. And then you're cold called out of the big blind. The initial open raiser folds. So let's just say it was under the gun open. Doesn't matter. So you made a 3-bet and got flat called by the big blind. Cold called. The flop comes queen of clubs, 10 of diamonds, 7 of spades. And the action is check, bet, call. So villain checks. You make a continuation bet, and villain calls. When the turn comes the ace of hearts and your opponent checks, then you check back. And the river card comes the 2 of clubs, and your opponent checks once again. I think the difference between these two examples, now that you've heard both of them, read both of them, might give you some clues as to where we're going with this, okay? So let's start with the 6 max online cash game. In this spot, when we make a 3-bet and our opponent flats us out of the big blind, and the flop comes out Queen 10-7, it's not at all unlikely that flop hits our opponent's range. I mean, it should be hitting his range. I would say if he's going to have a flat calling range in this spot at all, some players won't, then his flat calling range is going to contain a lot of things like Jack King, or I guess I should say King Jack, King Queen, Queen Jack, mediocre type hands that are too strong in his view to fold and not strong enough in his view to raise, and not weak enough to raise as a bluff. And that's going to be a lot of middling Queen 10 type cards. Depending on the opponent, maybe like 9-8 suited could be in there as well. So when the action goes check, bet, call, we should have something. We shouldn't be, I don't think we should be just going crazy with bluffs on this flop against a cold call from the big blinds range. When the ace comes on the turn and he checks and we check back, I mean, what does it look like we have? I mean, to me it looks pretty obviously like a hand like pocket kings, or maybe king queen suited could have taken this exact blind, I think. So when the ace comes out and our opponent checks and we check back, it kind of looks like we have something, but it's not something that we feel like we can value bet on the flop, turn, and river. So we're taking a pot control line. Maybe we're a little bit scared of the ace, or we think it's going to make it hard for us to get value from second best hands because we've got, at this point maybe second pair. And that's, usually going to be the case. So when the river bricks off, if our opponent kind of knows what's going on and he checks again, well, what kind of hand does he have? If he's got something really good, he should be leading, right? Or if he's got a pretty strong value hand, you'd expect him to be leading here. I mean, very rarely is a player going to take this line with, like, King Jack. After we check the turn back, he can't expect that we're going to just bet the river when a 2 shows up, right? So most of the time, our opponent's going to have a bluff catcher. He's going to have something like a weak queen, or like a queen, like Queen Jack, or a hand like maybe King 10, a hand where he would really just like to get the hand to showdown, and he probably will be willing to pay off some kind of bet, but he won't be willing to put too much money in. So if we know that our opponent's going to have a hand something like a good 10 or a bad queen, then that's what we can target. And that's really what I'm talking about in the entire video, is if we know what kind of hand our opponent is likely to hold, then we know how much we need to risk if we're bluffing, and how much we can afford to value bet without getting most of his second best hands that are in his range to fold. So in this spot, I think we can go pretty small with our bluffs. We don't have to pile in 2 times the size of the pot to get him to fold. And we probably ought to go slightly smaller with our value bets. If we have a hand like Ace 2 suited that we were kind of bluffing with pre-flop, bluffing with on the flop, and once we got to the turn, we picked up some showdown value and we checked, but by the time the river card comes out and our opponent checks again, now we feel like we can make sort of a thin-ish value bet. I think we should make a smaller value bet because our opponent's going to be fairly elastic, and we have a pretty good idea of what types of hands we're going to try to get value from. Now, on the other end of that, if we had something more like 9-8 suited, and for whatever reason we didn't barrel the turn, I guess just kind of play along with me, something like that. If we had some kind of a hand that we decided at this point at the river we don't have the best hand, and we have we want to win the pot, we're going to have to bluff. So we can look at that and we can say, well, we know what our opponent's range looks like. It's likely to be value or bluff catcher heavy, not have a lot of nutted value hands, if any, but also it probably doesn't contain a lot of air. Then we know if we if we bet something like 2/3 the size of the pot, we're probably going to get a good or disproportionate number of folds. I mean, if we really want to go for it here, we can just make very large bluff bets. You know, we can bet like 2 times the size of the pot with a bluff, and we can like never call. And if we'd like to, we can use a smaller bet size for value, for thin value. But now, when you do that, you really are playing out of balance, and a good observant opponent will catch on to that. So I'll just kind of leave that up to your discretion, but I think it's helpful to be aware of it as a concept. So if we look at the first example, I think this is an example when we check raise this flop, get called, and exactly called. We don't get raised. He doesn't fold, he doesn't raise, he just calls. The turn comes, and again, he doesn't raise, he doesn't fold, he simply calls. The river comes out with an ace on it. I think this is a spot where our opponent is pretty likely to be relatively inelastic. He's not going to fold an ace no matter how much we bet. He's not going to call with a busted draw. He's probably not going to call with his pocket pairs that are, say, like below the 9. And he's not calling with his combo draws that were like like small pair plus diamond draw, like pair of 2s plus a diamond draw, a pair of 9s plus a diamond draw, or his combo draws are not going to call pretty much regardless of what we bet. His aces are not going to fold pretty much regardless of what we bet. So if we happen to be in this spot with a hand like a full house or something like that, maybe even strong trips like ace king, we can make a pretty good sized value bet, and we can use again, this is if we want to be exploitable and unbalanced and we're not too worried about that. We could recognize the fact that our opponent's likely to be not elastic. He's probably pretty inelastic here, and we can value bet really big, and we can bluff relatively small because we know what we're targeting. We know that we're targeting the when we're bluffing, we're targeting the busted draws in his range and the busted combo draws and the like pocket 8s type hands. So we don't have to bet very big. And kind of conversely, if we are value betting, we know we're not going to get called by his busted draws, and we can bet pretty big for value, because he's not going to fold the stuff that we're targeting for value almost regardless of what we bet. He's not going to call with the range of hands we're trying to bluff against almost regardless of how small we bet. So you can look at it as trying to figure out what your opponent's got, and then using the same bet size, you're targeting the part of his range that you expect him to be on, and you can use the same size bet for a bluff as you would for a value bet. And I think that just knowing that you're targeting, knowing what you're trying to get value out of, and knowing what hands you're trying to fold out is a huge, huge thing. And you can take it a step further and even more exploitative, and you can really hone in on and look for opportunities and situations where your opponent is going to be very elastic or very inelastic. And if your opponent is inelastic, then you can vary your bet sizes to really profitable levels. You can really hone in and pick perfect bet sizes. But when you do that, you do run the risk, and I would say especially in the first example where we're playing a $20 heads-up match, it's not going to take too many showdowns for our opponent to figure out what's going on here if we do take advantage of that. But then again, if we're playing against a very observant, very good opponent, then we would expect that he's probably going to be, he's not often going to be inelastic to begin with. So questions or comments, post them. If you'd like to see more videos done this way, let me know. And if you've got a specific concept or specific subject that you'd like to see me do this type of video on, let me know and I'll try to get to it. I'm going to try to put out a couple of these per month. That's the game plan right now. A little busy with other things right now, but I'm going to try to do at least one video every other week, if not one a week. Until next time, Navanad over and out.